Hello Internet! So it's quite evident what this video is about. Feel free to download my slides in the link in the description. So this video forms part of a much larger video I did on brain networks, so feel free to check that out, the link is in the description below. So to give context to your already dwindling attention spans, why might you find this topic interesting? Well, most people don't know much about their minds apart from how it feels to be a mind, and it can be incredibly beneficial to know about your mind and how it works, how the machine operates, so to speak. So if you're an academic, you might learn a few new things in this video, especially toward the end of the video. If you're a uni student or just someone fascinated by the science of life like I am, then be prepared to have your mind blown by what you are. I'm going to start with mindfulness and cannabis, just as a reference point because it is the most used recreational drug worldwide and because similar results were seen with mindfulness and psychedelics in studies. So in mindfulness-based practices, researchers found increased or enhanced functional connectivity between the default mode network and the salience network. So what is functional connectivity? First, let's look at structural connectivity, the physical connections between brain regions. Now, functional connectivity is the statistical dependence between spatially distinct neurophysiological signals. So how likely it is that the neuronal excitations in one network may send signals or become correlated to another network. And, how well they're connecting with each other, sending information back and forth and such. Coming back to the salience network and mindfulness, researchers found this increased connectivity because of the participants' ability to attend to current experience without judgment, and this is something which I'll come back to later. It's called decentering. But for cannabis, it was actually found to reduce functional connectivity between the salience network and the default mode network. Remember that the salience network is responsible for what we pay attention to, what we ascribe meaning to or find interesting, and the default mode network is activated during daydreaming when we don't have any tasks to do. So what this decrease in functional connectivity between the salience network and DMN means under the influence of THC is that there is increased ability for the mind to wander while also at the same time having some attributes of the central executive network still intact, so reasoning faculties and such, as well as an altered sense of what we find interesting and meaningful and what we basically attend our awareness to, what we're picking up from the external environment, and we do see that in terms of its effect. Now, for those that don't know, there's actually two compounds found in cannabis. The first is THC, which is psychoactive. The second is CBD. It's not psychoactive, so it doesn't get you high. It has anti-inflammatory properties. It's an anxiolytic, so reduces anxiety. It's also a CB1 allosteric modulator. I really find it interesting what that is, but I don't have time to go into it in this video. But the most interesting thing about it is that there's actually evidence to suggest it's neuroprotective in combination with THC. So it reduces the memory impairments associated with THC and also reduces how much functional connectivity is lost because of THC. So with THC, there were actually improvements to attention and awareness in individuals with ADHD, and that result is kind of counterintuitive considering that ADHD individuals have stronger interactions in the salience network and the DMN. So that could be a potential future research project, as well as seeing whether overall THC in combination with CBD could be used as a drug for curbing attentional deficits, even despite some evidence to suggest that it does have a detrimental effect on memory and to some degree intelligence long term. Now time for psychedelics. So many classic serotonergic psychedelics like psilocybin work on the 5-HT2A receptor. It's important to note here that the density of 5-HT2A receptors is very high in cortical midline hubs of the salience network and the default mode network. So when people take psychedelics, we're going to see a lot of activity there basically. And electrical activity in those networks are altered due to the way this neurochemical operates in the synapse and changes electrical potentials after depolarization at the synaptic junction. Just some qualitative data here on the experience itself to put things into context, of course. There was a psychological questionnaire given to participants at the end of 14 months after the experience. This is called the Mystical Experience Survey. I've left the link in the description below. 58 and 67% of participants rated psilocybin occasion experience as among the 5 most personally meaningful and among the 5 most spiritually significant experiences of their lives. 64% indicated that the experience increased well-being or life satisfaction. 58% met criteria for having had a complete mystical experience. And as some of you may be wondering, what's the reliability of this questionnaire? Well, so a study reviewed this and found that it was quite reliable. Other character effects from psychedelics include more empathy, connection to the environment, and connection to other people. So these are some really interesting results in terms of what altering salience network activity can offer a human individual in liberating them from such things as depression, anxiety, trauma, all due to increased functional connectivity between those brain networks. Visualizing now functional connectivity with psilocybin. So in the top left is the placebo group, and the top right is the psilocybin group. So in blue we have the activity of the salience network measured as a relative bold signal, which we talked about earlier. We can see in the placebo group in the top left, the DMN in red is far out of sync with the salience network in blue. And on the right, in the psilocybin group, we see far more synchronicity in fluctuation. Now, it's important to read this chart correctly, given that both networks are inversely correlated. You might think that as red goes up, blue should go down, right? But remember, this study is measuring functional connectivity, so if blue and red match more together, then it means there is better communication going on between those networks and not so out of sync. So we know the salience network is the switch between the default mode network and the task positive network, and we also see similar results in the salience network with psychedelics. Increased functional connectivity between the default mode network and the task positive network after psilocybin. And interesting to note as well that the same functional connectivity was found in psychosis and states of meditation. There are phenomenological similarities between the psychedelic state and the meditation state, and it's proposed that the DMN-TPN functional connectivity is related to the separateness of internally and externally driven focus states. The image in the bottom left is a computer-generated representation of the increased functional connectivity under the influence of psilocybin and after. Here is that same image again, showing the functional connectivity of the TPN and DMN under psilocybin. This is in the bottom image. I couldn't find much research on the central executive network compared to the default mode and salience networks, but it is quite self-explanatory what its functions are. With respect to meditation, we see increased functional connectivity, and psychedelics, increased functional connectivity between the default mode and central executive. So psychedelics have also been shown to alter the integrity of and coupling between the executive control network to other networks. So we come now to the default mode, which is one of the primary networks that psychedelics modulate. So similar results were found with psychedelic drugs, reduced blood flow to the posterior cingulate cortex and medial prefrontal cortex. And also one study on the effects of LSD demonstrated that it desynchronizes brain activity within the DMN. So from this we can see psychedelics and meditation are shown to deactivate and activate the same areas of the brain. And they have a very similar effect, only one without a visual stimuli from the 5-HT2A receptors in the occipital cortex. Now this is a really interesting finding that has a lot of implications, and I will talk about that soon. So just recapping some of that research again, we know that psilocybin is a classic psychedelic and a good candidate for the drug model of psychosis, and we see that through increased functional connectivity between the DMN and the TPN. The same functional connectivity was observed in psychosis and states of meditation, as well as sedation too. And another point here is that ketamine, a horse tranquilizer, that's a dissociative and an antagonist of the NMDA receptor, was found to disrupt the frontal control of the DMN, so disconnects the medial prefrontal cortex and the subgenual cortex from the DMN for a period of time and allows other parts of the brain to take over resting thought. So just to visualize some of the data we've seen so far, in the top left we see the post-placebo group, and the coupling strength is lower than the post-psilocybin group, coupling strength being connectivity to other networks. And then on the right image we see the individuals who took psilocybin. We saw the coupling strength within those networks were decreased before and then increased after. Similarly, we found increased connection to the thalamus in the top left, with post-placebo being lower than post-psilo. that was also found with the thalamus to task positive network connection as well. So I want to get into some of the psychological characteristics of the effects of alterations to the connectivity within the DMN. And it was seen after psilocybin administration that cortisol levels spiked, and then the associated activation of the executive control network, and then diminishing of the DMN because they're anti-correlated. And following this, there was a subsequent increased control over emotional processes and relief of negative thinking and persistent negative emotions. So then after 2 months and 14 months after the experience, they were rated on trait openness, cognitive behavioral flexibility and positive attitude and mood, as well as social effects and behaviors. And they all rated very high on those, as well as a decrease in depressive symptoms in terminally ill cancer patients. One double-blind study even reported persistent positive changes in attitude and behavior after a single dose for up to 25 years. So these findings suggest that psilocybin might be a valuable compound for the treatment of psychiatric conditions. And the efficacy of psilocybin in alcohol dependence showed a significant reduction with large effect sizes. Tobacco dependency saw 80% of the participants had quit smoking after 6 months, and the most common reasons they gave were changing orientation toward the future so that long-term benefits outweighed the immediate desires. That was 73%, and strengthening participants' beliefs in their ability to quit, 73%, and changing life priorities and values such that smoking was no longer more important than quitting, 68%. Similarly, one study in this year, 2022, found MDMA or ecstasy use and psilocybin use were associated with lower odds of psychological distress and suicidal thoughts in a sample of US adults. So there's also some research to say that meditation can enhance the beneficial effects of psychedelic administration. 2 high-dose psilocybin experience gave higher support in meditation and showed greater psychological benefits from mystical type experiences. So this concept of decentering is the key mindfulness skill that involves disidentifying with thoughts and feelings and seeing them as mere thoughts and feelings as representations in the mind rather than as a reality itself. So the thoughts of I am hopeless, I am unworthy, they recognize it as just a thought, a representation of the world that could be wrong. And this experience, recognizing representations as representations, is called phenomenal opacity in philosophy. So from Dr. Lethaby's book, Philosophy of Psychedelics, published by Oxford University Press, he suggested that psychedelics do the same thing but from the other direction. So while mindfulness ultimately causes one's self-model to collapse by gradually chipping away at it, decentering, psychedelics induce decentering by directly disrupting the neural substrates of the self-model. And by disrupting the functioning of the default mode and salience networks, psychedelics induce experiences in which a sense of self dissolves, or its boundaries become weakened and blurred. When psychedelics disrupt self-modeling, they stop us identifying with all the things, including stories, narratives, thoughts, feelings, and perspectives we usually identify with. These mental concepts don't necessarily go away, but they are no longer experienced as me, so they can be viewed with more distance, spaciousness, detachment, objectivity, clarity, and humor. It's really important to note that it's not a cure-all magic bullet. Some people can compartmentalize their learnings into something called a spiritual ego, a grandiose fabrication of self that is esteemed because of its newfound understanding and connection to the world and phenomenal opacity, and also that it does not guarantee immunity from risk or detriment. While it's very safe in controlled environments with professionals, some individuals may be more at risk than others due to sensitivity of mind or even latent psychosis. Now, this research is all well and good as research, but what is it explaining exactly? And what does it mean in a broader context of self and how we put our worlds and beliefs together? I mean, what good is neuroscientific research unless we apply it to other disciplines like psychology and philosophy, right? So some of the authors of this research, Carhart and Friston, in 2019, suggest that the DMN and the SN encode for a self-model that is hierarchical and predictive in nature. So building our conception of ourselves from hierarchies of data that is predictive in nature. And they discovered a person's beliefs were in many ways associated within midline hubs of the SN and the DMN. And so in waking cognition, they provide a kind of probabilistic inference of what reality and self are. So this hierarchical self-model is thought to be something that binds information from the outside world, integrates it in many different ways and modalities, and posits a sense of self. Now, there is contention already in philosophy and neuroscience whether free will or self or ego actually exists, and one of, if not the oldest religion in Hinduism, and then Buddhism, some 100 or 1,000 years later, have at the core of their sage mystical insights that it doesn't. That we're all one consciousness in delusion, dancing a play of some kind. So Dr. Chris Letheby, in his book of Philosophy of Psychedelics, notes that these modulations to the SN and the DMN implicate changes to sense of self because they are both independently plausible neural substrates of self-representation, or at least minimal forms of self-representation. We'll come back to this in the default mode network section. Lastly, there is talk of something called the reset theory, and it suggests that sometimes both networks get caught in rigid and dysfunctional configurations. Psychedelics then help modulate these networks through increased connectivity, through imposing what is known as disorder or entropy, and through this disorder there is a kind of therapeutic potential for those inflexible pathological configurations to be released, and therefore reevaluations of self to occur. So now on to the task positive network. Lastly, there is talk of something called the reset theory, and it suggests that sometimes both networks get caught in rigid and dysfunctional configurations. Psychedelics then help modulate these networks through increased connectivity, through imposing what is known as disorder or entropy, and through this disorder there is a kind of therapeutic potential for those inflexible pathological configurations to be released, and therefore reevaluations of self to occur. Now on to the researchers' psychological hypothesis from their research. So in 2010, Carhart, Harris and Friston provided neuropsychoanalytic account of what's going on here. They postulated that the DMN was an orchestra conductor, or a corporate executive of the brain, preventing signals from being interrupted or interfering with each other. And they also believe the DMN may have been an evolutionary mechanism, as it doesn't become active until later in a child's development, typically around age 5. Their hypothesis was that as we mature, we tend to use life's learnings to create algorithms in order to respond to various situations throughout the day. And so our perception of reality is filtered through these habitual connections that become increasingly ingrained as we grow older. In 2018, Dimitrov offered an analysis of that paper, and he saw that the central executive network and the salience network were to be viewed as the true representatives of Freudian ego. And his hypothesis criticized Carhart, Harris and Friston's postulation of the default mode network being the brain representative of Freudian ego. So research is still unclear on how much the Freudian ego exists within the DMN exclusively, yet psychedelics reveal truth to the magnitude the default mode network plays in the construction of some kind of Freudian ego. But perhaps the notions of self are a problem created linguistically. So language based on the sentence composed of subject, verb, predicate contains a hidden belief system that events are started by nouns, by things. In the objective world, there are no things at all, really. It's just a kind of soup of activity going on, of all different processes all merged with each other and no distinctions at all. Contrary to the view that the universe is the sum total of all things, it's quite a shock to common sense. So this leads to an infinite regress. What is a thing? You say an object, but that's just a substituted word. And so this becomes a fallacy of abstraction and categorization that the brain makes by default for survival value, thingifying the world, as it were. So the brain needs to break down the world into units to actually understand it. But it may very well be that we mistake those bits of information for a self and for a real reality. So in philosophy, this is called the reification fallacy. And in this view, reality and self are more like a Rorschach blot, rather than a material substance or self that persists and always does, determinately. So if you're interested in this, I have another video on the philosophical interpretations of this neuroscientific research. Feel free to check that out. I've left the link in the description below. So the implications of some of this research on psychedelics, well, it could be used to recondition unethical minds or people with a psychopathological conditioning. And I do find this to be very fascinating and necessary for society to know of, and have written half a thesis on it already. So by reconfiguring how the salience and default mode network interact, we could potentially reconfigure a person's understanding of ethical relationships to the world and through self with appropriately trained professionals. Now, this occurs through the altered concept of self in relation to past experiences, where we build our ethics from, essentially. As seen from psychedelics, alterations with functional connectivity of the default mode network and salience networks cause subjects' empathy to increase, reevaluate their notions of self and reality. So the methodology for psychedelic-assisted therapy requires input from philosophy with respect to accounting philosophically for altered self-conception, i.e. the many explanations of consciousness and non-ego, i.e. idealism, panpsychism, monism, dualism, materialism, and helping the patient rebuild and reevaluate human constructs of ethics and morality with respect to their mystical or revelationary experiences. And understanding and integrating those ethical and moral constructs in relation to their learned social paradigms informed by upbringing, emotional trauma, social conditioning, which are direct causes to delinquent and criminal behavior. So the prison system is obviously not the best place, because a lot of those behaviors are just simply reinforced through being subject to other people with similar tendencies. So what's the prime candidate here to bring about this change? Clearly, it's the default mode network in terms of its relation to self-conception and self-narrative, and it's also the salience network in terms of communication, social behavior, self-awareness, integration of sensory, emotional, and cognitive information, all needed to reconfigure a person's ethical relationships to themselves and the world. So from the neuroscientific research on psychedelics and meditation already discussed, brain regions and networks responsible for producing expanded awareness of self and other are orientated within the same place. We know that, the DMN and the SN. It includes deactivation of the DMN and functional connectivity with the salience network. So this functional connectivity between the salience network and the default mode networks provides a vantage point for understanding newfound experiences of oneself, social and behavior self-reevaluations, integration of sensory, emotional, cognitive information. So the premise here is that a person with a good conscience extracts his morality from his capacity to empathize, as well as his sense of self. So in psychiatric conception, these drugs are a device upon the mind which can temporarily relieve the ego from its boundedness to the subconscious faculties of the mind, allowing for a deeper reevaluation psychologically. So this potential opportunity for subjects to reevaluate their own morality needs research due to the pressing ethical problem of the lack of rehabilitation within prisons, and moreover, the failed punitive justice systems worldwide. So I also have a video on psychedelic research and drug law change, as well as potential implications for mass use of psychedelics. So feel free to check that out. Remember that all the references are in the slides below, and they're downloadable in the description section. Thank you all for listening, and I bid you farewell.